Hey Magic players, this is Ben with MTG Frontier Guide, and today we've got something special. We're doing a Bant Humans modern deck tech. And so this is actually going to be the deck that I'm taking to the SCG Open this weekend in Dallas, Texas. Okay, so to start the deck out, we're going to cover our non-creature spells. We have 4 copies of Collected Company. If you've watched any of my other deck techs, you'll know that I love this card. This card can be used to cheat our creatures into play at instant speed, so we can do it on their turn, either mid-combat or at their end step, to avoid any kind of sorcery speed removal. It's just a great utility card to play in the creature-heavy deck. And then our only other non-creature spell in the deck is going to be 4 copies of Path to Exile. Path to Exile is a very good removal spell because it's unconditional, and it does have the downside of allowing them to search for a basic land from their deck and put it into play. But if you're familiar with Modern, you'll know that it is one of the best cards, best removal cards in the format. Now moving into the creatures, we have 4 copies of Champion of the Parish. Champion of the Parish gets a +1/+1 counter anytime a human enters the battlefield under your control. So if left unchecked, he can actually get rather large, seeing how we're playing 31 creatures in the deck. Next up in the 1-drop slot, we have 4 copies of Noble Hierarch. Noble Hierarch is that perfect answer for the 1-drop mana accelerant in this deck, and it has the added bonus of having Exalted to help whenever you just attack with that single creature, so it gets that extra +1/+1 for the turn. Now moving into the 2-drop slot, we actually have 3 different lords that we're running in the deck. First up, we have 4 copies of Metallic Mimic, and obviously we're going to name humans when it enters the battlefield. What it does is it provides all of our humans a +1/+1 counter when they enter the battlefield, and the ability does stack as well. So if you have multiple Mimics out, then your humans will get multiple +1/+1 counters on them when they enter. Then we're running 4 copies of Thalia's Lieutenant. When Thalia's Lieutenant enters the battlefield, you get a +1/+1 counter on all of the other humans you control. And it also has the same ability as Champion of the Parish, so whenever another human enters the battlefield, Thalia's Lieutenant will get a +1/+1 counter. And our last lord is going to be 4 copies of Mayor of Avabruck, and he's actually more of a traditional lord in the sense that he just provides +1/+1 to all of your other humans while he's on the battlefield. Now, he is a werewolf, so he does transform into the Halpak Alpha, and the Halpak Alpha provides wolves and werewolves +1/+1 while it's on the battlefield, and it also creates a 2/2 wolf token at the beginning of your end step on each turn. Next up, we'll move into our utility creatures. First up, we have 2 copies of Snapcaster Mage. We don't want to go overboard with Snapcaster Mage because we're not running a lot of targets for it to hit out of the graveyard. Really, the most common application of the Snapcaster is just going to be Snap and then Path. So that way you can just recast a Path to Exile from the graveyard, and it does provide a human that can enter the battlefield at flash speed as well, and so that way it can trigger some of those other human enter the battlefield effects. And then we have 3 copies of Meddling Mage. Now, Meddling Mage is a very useful creature. Certain decks can deal with it quite easily. Other decks have a lot more trouble dealing with it. So depending on the type of removal that they're running, it can actually be quite troublesome for them, especially if they're only running one type of removal, because when Meddling Mage enters the battlefield, you get to choose a non-land card, and that card can't be played. So you can't play it, and your opponent can't play it. So if you name Path to Exile, you will not be able to play Path to Exile as well. So keep that in mind whenever you play Meddling Mage. But it does actually shut down quite a few decks if you can get it on the board and get it to stick, depending on what decks you're running. It obviously helps if you have a good idea of what those other decks are running, if you're familiar with the format. So the more familiar you are with Modern and the decks that are typically played, the more effective Meddling Mage will actually end up being. And to finish up the deck, we have 2 copies of Reflector Mage, just to kind of help with the tempo play. Obviously, we want to get a bunch of creatures down and swing in, so anytime we can bounce one of their blockers and get in for some damage and make sure they can't recast that blocker on the next turn, we want to do that. And it can be hit by Collected Company as well. And then we have 4 copies of Renegade Rallier, and I'm sure you've seen Renegade Rallier if you've watched any of my other videos as well. Another card that I'm very fond of, and with Modern, he's no exception. He's still just as good as he is in Frontier. You do have access to fetch lands, and so Revolt is very easy to trigger with this deck. And you have a lot of different creature options in the deck to get back from the graveyard, and you can also grab lands if you need to as well. Okay, so now we're going to move into our land base. We've got 4 copies of Windswept Heath, 4 copies of Flooded Strand, and because I don't have any Misty Rainforest, we have 2 copies of Wooded Foothills. Obviously, if you have Misty Rainforest, you can sub those in as well, and they're going to be a little bit more efficient. I'm hoping to get some now that we're getting the reprints in the Modern Masters 2017 set. Now moving into the Shocklands, we have 2 copies of Breeding Pool, 2 copies of Temple Garden, and 1 copy of Hallowed Fountain. Obviously the green is a major part of the deck, so we want to make sure we have those forest in duplicates, and then the Hallowed Fountain just there as another option to grab with the fetch lands. Okay, and we're going to finish up the deck with 2 basic forest, 2 basic plains, and 1 basic island. Okay, so moving into the sideboard, we're going to start out with 3 copies of Ceremonious Rejection. Ceremonious Rejection helps with one of my worst matchups, which is Tron, and any deck running Ensnaring Bridge. So obviously we want to bring in all 3 copies against both of those decks, and then Ceremonious Rejection can also be brought in against decks like Affinity that have a lot of artifacts. Okay, next up we have 2 copies of Heron's Grace Champion. We have him in here specifically for the lifelink and the ability to flash in and give the team lifelink and pump them as well. So we want to bring him in against decks like Burn or Naya Zoo or some other kind of zoo build. Any kind of an aggressive build that's dealing a lot of damage that we need to gain some life and kind of stabilize ourselves. We have a lot of creatures already, so when he gives all of the creatures +1/+1 and lifelink, you can end up gaining quite a bit of life off of that. Now, I know he is 4 converted mana cost, and so some of the time what you'll end up doing is actually pulling out 2 of the Collected Companies to put him in there, especially against decks like Burn, where you don't want to increase your curve at all. You want to keep it consistent with the way that it's been running, but you give yourself that added lifelink in there. Now, also, we bring him in whenever we bring in our Graveyard Hate, because we get rid of our Snapcaster Mages and our Renegade Ralliers, so we make room for him in there as well, just as an extra body, something that's going to be relevant even if we put out the Rest in Peace, which you'll see here in a minute on the sideboard. Next up is going to be 2 copies of Leyline of Sanctity. Anytime the opponent's running some kind of strategy where they need to target you, whether it be Burn, Hand Disruption, or Mill, or something along those lines, you'll want to bring in the Leyline of Sanctity, and it's a free spell that you get to start out with on the board if you have it in your opening hand. Next up is 2 copies of Natural State. Like I said earlier, Ensnaring Bridge is definitely problematic if it hits the battlefield, so we want to make sure we have some sideboard answers for the card, and also things like Blood Moon and Affinity. There's a bunch of different things that Natural State can help with. And then we have 2 copies of Rest in Peace for any kind of graveyard shenanigans. Anything like Dredge or possibly Delve decks, or even Storm decks that rely on flashing back cards from their graveyard. And typically when we bring in the Rest in Peace, we are going to be siding out the Snapcaster Mages and the Renegade Ralliers, and we'll be bringing in the Heron's Grace Champions, and then the next sideboard card, which is 2 copies of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. She's really good against decks that need to be casting multiple non-creature spells in one turn. those decks are when you always want to bring her in. But she's also another human, so she does trigger all the human effects as well in the deck. And to finish up the sideboard, we have 2 copies of Stony Silence. As I said at the beginning of the sideboard, we do have a pretty poor matchup against Tron in Game 1. So once we've boarded on the Ceremonious Rejections and the Stony Silences post-board, the matchup becomes a lot better at that point in time. And Stony Silence also shuts down Affinity and forces it to have an answer as well before it can continue to even function as a deck. Well, I hope that you enjoyed our deck tech today for modern Bant Humans. I'm taking it to the SCG Open this weekend, and we'll see how it performs. I'll make sure to post some results when we're done with it. If you liked the video, make sure you hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure to subscribe. It helps us out a lot. And we thank you again for watching the video. Now get out there and play some Magic and have some fun.